Welcome in the sanctuary of Wilshire Presbyterian Church. Today we are going to finish up with the final discourse of Jesus. Remember, for the last 6 weeks we've been going back and forth between chapters 13 to 17. Which bring me tonight to the final question. What would you say to your friends, to your loved ones, if you know that you are about to die, that this will be the last time you're seeing it? Now, we don't have to guess with Jesus, because we actually does have his answer to this question. That is what the final discourse is. It's the final words Jesus said to the people he loved, to the disciples, on the night of his arrest. And it is interesting that if you take that chapters 13 to 17 together and you condensed it and you try to summarize it, it actually says the same thing over and over, just in various ways. It says, love one another as I have loved you. So let's read it tonight. We're reading from chapter 13, verses 30 to 35. And it starts like this. Judas, with a piece of bread, left. It was night. When he had left, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is seen for who he is, and God seen for who he is in him. The moment of God is seen in him, God's glory will be displayed. In glorifying him, he himself is glorified. Glory all around. Children, I am with you for only a short time longer. You are going to look high and low for me. But as I have told the Judeans, I am telling you, where I go, you are not able to come. Let me give you a new command. Love one another. In the same way I loved you, you love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see you have love for each other. Now, I want you to focus on what Jesus doesn't say. This is his final words to his disciples. This is the words of a dead man walking. He doesn't say to his disciples, well, keep the faith. Things are going to get rough, but keep the faith. He doesn't say, you should come with me and die with me on the cross. You should stay loyal to me to the very bitter end on the cross. He doesn't say to them, well, the most important thing is what you believe. You should believe the right things. He doesn't tell you how to do church. He doesn't tell the disciples what songs they should sing in church or how they should worship. He doesn't tell them, go out in the world and spread the gospel. The most important thing that Jesus says to his disciples that night is, love one another as I have loved you. And he gives it a name. He calls it my new commandment. Now think of Moses and 10 commandments, that big a deal. Like, this is the most important thing Jesus wants to say on his final nights to his friends. This is what he wants them to remember. When I'm not here, love as I have loved you. Now I want you to pay attention to when this is all happening. It starts out by saying Judas leaves and it's night. See, remember, this chapter 13 is just after Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And as I reminded you a few weeks ago, Jesus washed their feet knowing that Judas is going to betray him, knowing that Peter will deny him 3 times, knowing that all the disciples will desert him. In other words, he knows they are going to fail him spectacularly. And still, he washes their feet. He knows afterwards they are going to remember that they failed him, that they let him down miserably. And still he washed their feet. Still he loved them. It's sort of what Thomas Merton once said. He said, we are called not to first stop and inquire whether somebody is worthy to be loved. We're just called to love them. And so Jesus says, remember when you did all this to me and I knew and I still loved your feet? That's how I want you to love others. In fact, just before this, he tells the disciples this. He says to Peter, you are going to betray. He says, the one who puts his hand in the bowl with me will betray me. And none of them can believe that that is possible. Every single one of them goes, me? Surely not me, Lord. Surely not me. Now, as a kid, I was always a little bit perplexed with this because I go, wait, if somebody put their hand in the bowl with Jesus, wouldn't everybody saw that? Well, that's just my ignorance. They ate with a big bowl of food in the middle, and then you break off your piece of bread and you dip it in the meaty sauce and you eat it. So everybody shares the same bowl. So everybody that night has actually put their hand in the bowl with Jesus. And that's why they're all reacting like, no, not possibly me. And then Jesus looks at Judas and says, you need to go do what you need to do. And that's when Judas leaves. And you would think just after Judas leaves, Jesus doesn't say, well, there he goes. There will be consequences for what he did. What he's done is evil. He doesn't do any of that judgment thing. He doesn't do any of that preachy thing. He turns to his disciples and says, love as I has loved you. They're going to remember me. Afterwards, they are going to remember when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, please pray with me. When he was scared and totally filled with fear that they fell asleep. And yet he knew and washed his feet, their feet. In the same way, you and I are called to love. We are not called to first stop and say, well, are you worthy of my love? Jesus reminds us, love without stopping. Love as I have loved you. Now you may say to yourself, wait a minute, didn't you already do a sermon about this love one another thing? And I will go, yes. That's because Jesus repeats this. He says here in chapter 13, and I'm going to read it again so you refresh your mind what we just read. He says in chapter 13, verse 34 to 35, let me give you a new commandment. Love one another in the same way I love you. You love one another. And then in chapter 15, verses 12, he says, this is my commandment. See, you were not imagining it. That you love one another as I have loved you. He's repeating it. But this time he says, no one has a greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. So in between these two bookends, Jesus fleshes out what this love looks like. And it can be something as mundane as washing your friend's feet, something humbling like that. Or it can be awe-inspiring, a heroic act of self-sacrifice to give up your life for your friend. Love is all of that. That is the love Jesus asks us to show. This life is full of darkness and struggles and prejudice and war and cruelty and evil. And our loving one another will not change that. And we are not asked to do that. We are simply asked to love as Jesus has loved us. Meaning that we don't ask requirements from another person in order to love them. We love them as they are. And we are asked to love the friend who, make a snide remark and then you just let it go. We are asked to keep on loving our friend that disappointed us or failed our expectations. Or somebody that's really hard to love because they're going through something and they're snappy and they are taking it out on you. We are asked to love when it's really hard and difficult to love. We're not asked to love perfectly. We are asked to love as Jesus loved us. No strings attached. So I read an interesting story this week, and I want to share it with you in a sermon a pastor wrote about his dad in the hospital, and it's in the few weeks before his dad passed away. And he writes this: I was standing in a hospital room many years ago now. It was during one of those dozen such stays after my dad's first heart surgery. A group of friends from church had come to see him. As I remember it, they stood awkwardly around his hospital bed, fumbling for words to say. Pretty soon, one of them offered a prayer, and once he was done, they did not take long to head for home. This was a kind group of people. They had traveled out of their way to make this visit and had to coordinate their schedules to do so. Still, they stumbled as they spoke, clearly uncomfortable in seeing my normally gregarious dad hooked up to all kinds of tubes and wires and looking very discouraged. They were not terribly good at it, I had to say, but I quickly learned that didn't much matter. For no sooner had they left the room than my dad turned to me and, speaking with great conviction, he said, "Anyone who doesn't have a church home is stupid." Now, to be sure, usually he is a little more eloquent than that. And as you well can imagine, I would hesitate to use his verbiage as a tagline in my congregation's outreach effort. For I can't imagine it would attract many more who are not already there. Still, he was at a point in his life that he wasn't mincing words anymore. And he meant what he said. For he had experienced over and over again what love looks like in the company of God's people. The kind of love that shares time and resources and hope and prayers. Love lived out through this kind of folks who, far from perfect, often did what they could to build up, to support, or simply walk alongside. People who try to live the kind of love that Jesus points to us in the gospel lesson for today. My dad had given and received this over and over again, and he could not understand why everyone wouldn't go and find that too, given half a chance. Somebody once said that this kind of love that Jesus is mirroring for us and asking us to do is a flickering kind of candle that holds off the darkness. We live in a dark world. When times are well, we can pretend that we don't live in a dark world. We can pretend that all this evil doesn't exist and all the suffering, until of course it happens to us, and then we have to face reality. Love cannot make that disappear. It cannot bring peace and equality and justice to this world. But love can hold that darkness at bay. When we find ourselves in a dark place, when we want to give up, when life is really a struggle, what helps us to heal, what helps us to be resilient, what gives us comfort is something coming alongside and just showing us love in imperfect ways. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they come alongside us and they walk with us and they see our pain and they love us. They love us when we are unlovable. They love us when we're cruel because it's hurting inside. That's the kind of Jesus, the love that Jesus asks us to love. Because that's how he loved. He knew what his friends were up to and still he washed their feet. You see, we don't live in heaven yet. And we don't live in the time yet when God will restore creation. When, like in the book of Revelation, it said there will be no more tears, no more pain, no more death, no more suffering. No, we live in the meantime. And in that meantime, we are called to love like Jesus. This commandment of Jesus echoes through the New Testament. Love one another. John 13, verse 34. Love one another. John 13, verse 35. Love one another. John 15, verse 12. Love one another. John 15, verse 17. Love one another, Romans 12, verse 10. Love one another, 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 12. Love one another, 1 Peter 1, verses 22. Love one another, 1 John chapter 3, verse 11. Love one another, 1 John 3, verse 23. Love one another, 1 John 4, verse 7. Love one another, 1 John 4, verse 11. Love one another, 1 John 4, verse 12. Love one another, 2 John 5. So Jesus says, love the way I loved you. And then we keep the darkness at bay, when it doesn't overwhelm us. So I want to invite you to think this week of where you love this way. Where did you love others as Jesus loved you? Amen.